Ted Williams. I'm the director of the South Dakota Developmental Center.
And Ted, as we talked about earlier, imagining a public out there that is interested in South Dakota, but they just don't know very much about the history here. They don't maybe even know that there is an institution in Redfield. Can you just tell us for that audience, the important role that this center has played over the years?
Well, the South Dakota Developmental Center has quite a history. We've actually been around since 1902. At that time, when the facility opened up, it was named the Northern Hospital for the Insane. Dr. J.K. Kotnewski was the first superintendent, and he didn't feel that was a good name for the facility. He didn't feel that that was the type of supports that we were giving to the citizens of South Dakota. So he lobbied from the very beginning for a name change. And then in 1913, he finally got his wish and changed, the legislature changed the name to really another unfortunate name, the State School for the Home and State School and Home for the Feeble-Minded, which carried on until 1951 when the name changed again to Redfield State Hospital and School. And during that time, the names kind of reflected the philosophy of the services that were provided to people with developmental disabilities over that century. In the early years, it seemed like there was a lot of care that was provided for the folks that were here, and training, and that kind of turned into, in the later years, more of an effort to segregate people with intellectual disabilities away from society for both what was deemed to be their protection as well as protection of society. In fact, in the mid-20s, the state legislature created the Commission for the Control of the Feeble-Minded that went on up and clear until the early 70s. And the purpose of that commission was to identify people with intellectual disabilities and to segregate them from the rest of society. And again, the names changed in the 50s and 60s and 70s. There really was an emphasis on bringing people into the institution and segregating them from society. And that lasted up until about the 70s. And in the mid-70s, Title 19 came in, which was Title 19 of the Social Security Act, which brought on Medicaid and provided federal funding for facilities like ours. And along with that federal funding came a lot of new rules and regulations that required many changes at the facility. And along with that also, the community support system within the state of South Dakota was also created along about that time. And the emphasis changed from people living in institutions their entire lives to moving them into community placements, back into their home communities. And the emphasis at the developmental center during that time actually changed, and we're providing more training for independent living, and so that people could leave our facility rather than living here forever. And in 1989, the name changed again to the current name, South Dakota Developmental Center. And actually, at that time, it was the South Dakota Developmental Center Redfield, because there was also a South Dakota Developmental Center Custer. And our population at the Developmental Center Redfield reached a population of 1,199 people in 1963. And there was a bunch of people that were moved to Custer in '63 when that facility came online. And so our population went down at that time. And that the name change kind of reflected what we were trying to do is develop some life skills for people so they could go and live in the community.
That was excellent. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Looking at that whole getting people out into their communities, deinstitutionalization, how has this been a leader? How has this center been a leader in shaping that work across the state?
Well, I think we've always, the change in philosophy from people being segregated in facilities like ours kind of changed naturally within the state of South Dakota. We started working together to move people that didn't seem to need the supports that we have at the developmental center, didn't need all that intense care. In fact, there were, at one time, 50% of the workforce at the developmental center were people who actually were residents here, who lived here. And in the 70s, that changed, and those people were no longer providing direct care to the other people that lived here. And it was just kind of natural that, you know, they had the skills to live in the community, and the community system was starting to build up. So we worked together with that community system to try and find people that did not need the care and services at the developmental center. And I just kind of naturally progressed, and you know, some states have had lawsuits in order to force that change. South Dakota has not had that. We've always felt that if people had the opportunity, they should live in a community setting whenever. And that philosophy continues today, and we continue to work with community-based facilities and other community supports in order to move people, when they're ready to leave the developmental center, out into the communities. One of the things that probably has changed for us over the years is that we have become sort of I call it a buffer for the community system. When people have difficulties in their lives, when they're living in the community, they need to have a place to go in order to have those issues dealt with. And that's kind of what the developmental center has become, is a support for those people that are really having difficulty living in the community. They come to our facility, we work with them to address those issues, which may be mental health in some cases, or behavioral challenges, to address those issues, and then when those person is stabilized, we move them back into their home communities.
Glad you made that point. That's really important. Let's just focusing on what it would be like for people who lived here. You mentioned 1963 was the peak year in terms of numbers. So let's look at 1963, 2012, from the perspective of somebody living here, a person supported. What would the differences be in their day-to-day life?
Well, there would be a big difference, and depending on the capabilities. Oh, I'm sorry, I got to ask you again. Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of set it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The changes that have occurred from the early '60s to today have been great. Back in the '60s, we still had a farm program at the developmental center. A lot of the people that lived here worked on the farm, helped to raise and bring in the crops, and worked in the garden. Some people helped with people to care for other people who were living here, and it kind of depended on their capabilities. Folks that have higher skills were placed in those positions. People that didn't have those skills were cared for by other people that were living out here. A lot of the times, of course, there were staff that were working with them, and the philosophy of those days, when I started as a social worker in 1976, I went back and developed some of the first social histories that we had at this facility, and it always amazed me that the number of admission documents that said, when the family was asked, why are you placing this person at the developmental center, how the responses were often, my doctor or my minister or some other significant person in the community has recommended that we place this person at the institution and just forget about them. And so what happened with that is a lot of times their families just kind of went away, and the staff at the developmental center or at the institution became their families. And so I imagine for some of those people that left the facility in those earlier years, they were leaving their families at the same time. And People don't stay quite as long now as they used to, but our staff still become families, and so there are some mixed emotions with some people when they leave their facility, just as there was back in 1963. But I don't know if I really addressed that quite right.
No, I think you got the first half just perfect, and then what would it be like, just a day-to-day experience for somebody here today?
Today, at the Developmental Center, we see ourselves as more of a treatment facility. So the people that are at our facility have specific issues that they're working on. So a lot of them will receive counseling, and so there are counseling groups that occur, individual counseling that occurs during the day. Most everybody that is not of school age also has a job. So they get up in the morning and they would go to the work, and depending on what their job is, some people actually work in our kitchen, washing dishes. Some people do janitorial work. Some people work on some contracts like we have for the fishermen in South Dakota. Most of them will know what bottom bouncers are, and we have many of our folks that actually work on making those bottom bouncers. We have a cooperative arrangement with the Redfield Lions Club, where we do paper recycling for the entire city of Redfield, and so a lot of the folks are involved in that sort of work. Then our younger people, we have one area that has adolescents, and they're all enrolled in the Redfield Public School. So they get up in the morning and go off to school just like other people their age. The Redfield Public School provides the teachers for us, and they can actually get a degree from Redfield High School as a part of attending school out here.
That's great. I didn't realize that. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's good. You addressed this a little bit, but I'm going to ask you again. Back, I guess about the time you started working here, when there were a lot of people moving out,
Mm-hmm.
had to be pretty emotional on both ends. For the people who worked here, had known these people for most of their lives, and we've picked up in talking to some of those people supported years ago. It was hard for them to say goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just kind of tell us about how that played out?
It was difficult for people to transition when we first had that big push back in the 70s. There was a number of people, again, when I started, there were probably 700 people who lived here, and the staff were sometimes resistive to having their people leave. It's like having a son or a daughter leave and go off to college or something, and it was difficult for staff, and for many of the folks that left here, it was very difficult for them. We had to do a lot of work on doing pre-visits to where they were going to go and working with them on building a relationship with the new staff they might be working with, and we still do that today.
Something I did not say I was going to ask you about, I just thought about this this morning walking around your campus here. It's incredible, the facility you have, the beautiful auditorium, and the other facilities for recreation. I've got to think that for a lot of people who came here, like say in the 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
They had to feel like they had a pretty good here. I mean, when you consider some of these farms where they were literally counting bites, they were so hungry. They knew they were going to have
Mm-hmm.
meals here. They knew there was a social experience here. Can you just explain a little bit about just the marvelous facility that the state built here?
Well, the facility has built up over a course of 110 plus years, and of course it depends on when a person was here, what they experienced. In the early years, they had jobs, worked on the farm. It was a very stable life for a lot of people. Some people that weren't as capable, probably wasn't as comfortable for them as it might have been later on in later years. But as the facility grew and built up, particularly in the 70s after Medicaid and Title 19 came to pass, and we started getting more recreational facilities. Our activity center was built after that time, our new food service, and facilities became, I guess, a little better. We also had a movement towards, back in the older days, people lived a lot of times in wards where there are open bays, where there might have been 40 people living in the same living area, in the same bedroom. Nowadays, everybody has their own bedroom, and there are much smaller areas, 8 to possibly 10 people, sometimes even less than that, live in one living area now. So that's a big change from the earlier years. I don't know if that went where you
Yeah,
reckoned, but
I'm glad you mentioned, yeah, that. How many people in a residential area, that's a big change. You know, I think I covered everything I wanted to ask you. Unless, is there anything you'd like to say, assuming that we might do a version of this that is more for like university students studying special education or human services? Would you want to talk to them about what they could learn in studying the history of Redfield? Just what changes they would see as especially relevant?
okay. Over the years, the facility has changed from more of a caretaker facility to one of training. A lot of things were occurring in the 60s and 70s where there was more knowledge about how to work with people with developmental disabilities. Today, we spend a lot of time doing counseling for mental health issues, which is something 20, 30 years ago we wouldn't have thought about doing. In fact, in the colleges and universities, they were teaching behavior modification as the only thing that would work for people with developmental disabilities. And we know now that those procedures are still good for use in some situations, but we do a lot more interactive type therapies with the folks that are at our facility now, and we found them to be very, very successful. We find that we have to do a lot of repetition, but a lot of the same things that work with the regular population works well with our folks also.
And then finally, I just wanted to give you opportunity to say anything else that you'd like to say that we haven't covered so far.
Well, I think we're really fortunate in South Dakota to have had the evolution that we have had. I'm involved in a national organization where several times a year I get together with other people that are heads of facilities in their own states, and I know in talking with them that the way we've gone about business over the years is much better than what other states have experienced. I think we've learned to work together with our communities in order to move people into the community settings when they are ready for it. Well, we don't have a philosophy where people should live in institutions, but we recognize that people have a choice to live in facilities like ours. But we try to emphasize that people should live in communities whenever possible. And the treatment that we provide at the Developmental Center is focused on getting people back into those community settings.